We begin with the ousted Venezuelan leader, Nicolas Maduro. He was in a federal courtroom in Manhattan today, the product of this controversial Trump administration foreign policy action. And we're going to report on all of that, the facts, the law, such as it is, and where we go from here tonight. There is, at minimum, major confusion, if not outright revulsion, at what the Trump administration has done in the name of the American people, without their input or consent through Congress or any other way. And there are questions now about the president's motives and plans across the board, even as many people look at the extraction effort and say, okay, the military did its job. They understood the assignment. They completed the objective. But what is the purpose of all this? Well, we begin with what's happening today, of course. This morning, Maduro and his wife were in federal court in the United States after that extraction that made so much controversial waves and attention across this weekend. Surely you watch the news, you've heard about it. So you're looking at the courtroom sketches that would be like any other case, except this is not like any other's case. We can tell you Maduro and his wife pled not guilty to a set of charges that have basically been developed over the years in the United States under multiple justice departments, and that includes narco-terror and drug trafficking. Maduro used his appearance in American court today, which is effectively the first time he's really had a platform to say anything after this unusual foreign policy attack and use of warlike United States power, to say, quote, "I have been kidnapped since Saturday. I was captured at my home in Caracas." A helicopter transported Maduro and his wife from where they were being held in federal custody in a Brooklyn jail this morning. You can see that transfer there. The armored van then drove them to the federal courthouse. Maduro also asserted what is, under at least international law and territorial jurisdiction, a fact as best we understood it, including according to the interim leadership of his country since he was extracted. He said, and I read this quote simply, "I am still president of my country." Now, as mentioned in Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, who was basically their version of his vice president, was also, as a practical matter, sworn in as the interim president, with Maduro being held under his resistance inside the United States. Secretary of State Rubio, Defense Secretary Hegseth, and other Trump officials are doing now what they refused to do in advance or even in the hours after this operation became public, which is, after this delay, briefing top lawmakers in both parties. There will be questions about what they are doing, what the plans are, and why, from the beginning of this operation, so many of the war powers that the Trump administration insists on wielding are done directly without any consultation or discussion, let alone formal authorization or vote from the United States Congress. You don't have to be a history buff to remember how much Donald Trump, the candidate, criticized the Republican Bush administration for the Iraq War. Trump, like many others, deemed it a failure, costly, external regime change, etc. But even that war, however unpopular it proved to be, was, of course, authorized by Congress. That is the way the Constitution and the War Powers Act envisions the use of these kind of war powers, period. Now, this issue is, as the Washington Post puts it, clouded in confusion. What the Trump administration is literally doing. Are we going to try to run this country, which is all about double the population of Iraq? If you would have asked any American going into, say, the Christmas break, which countries should we be at war with? Or is there a country that we want to run? Almost no one would say, let's go spend time, treasure, and risk on Venezuela for whatever reasons. And Trump and Rubio are, even as they oversee this project, essentially contradicting each other.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
What we are running is the direction that this is going to moving forward.
Don't ask me who's in charge, because I'll give you an answer and it'll be very controversial.
What does that mean?
It means we're in charge.
Are you running Venezuela right now?
Yeah, I mean, I keep people, fixating on that. It's not running, it's running policy. The policy with regards to this.
The president, we're running it and in charge. His chief diplomat, national security advisor, who was involved in all this, says, no, not that. That's the first clue that something has already gone off the rails. Whatever one thinks about Maduro and the many terrible autocrats around the world, The fact that the president and his chief diplomat can't keep their story straight in the opening days of this action. The president also didn't do what you would expect any president to do, and even one like him, mindful of public relations, what they usually do is give a presentation to the country or an Oval Office address. President Trump recently did that for a small, more minor item, quite frankly, his sort of update on the country and the economy, but didn't bother that here, or the congressional authorization or consultation, as I mentioned. So, if you want to know why we are down there and whether we are running the place or not, you can't get a straight answer as we start the week on Monday after the weekend operation. Now, there is a problem with drug trafficking in the region. That's well known. But Trump has started talking a lot about oil and claiming that this is a kind of a long-term capitalist plan to help nationalist U.S. oil companies, that he tipped off businesses that might do more oil production, potentially. By the way, that's a long-term project with a lot of complexity, but businesses tied to the United States economy that might do more of that, and he says he tipped them off before even Congress.
Spoken with the oil companies about
Yes.
going into Venezuela?
I have.
Which ones? Have you received any commitments?
All of them, basically.
Any commitments from the oil companies?
They want to go in so badly.
Speak with them before the operation took place?
Yes.
Did you maybe tip them off about
Before and after.
What is going to happen to those reserves?
We're going to run everything. We're going to run it, fix it. We'll have elections at the right time. But the main thing you have to fix, it's a broken country.
There is so much in those couple statements. I'm just going to walk you through them because this is important. Number one, Donald Trump is claiming that these business and oil interests came before you, the American public, as represented by your Congress, as we go to war. And however this operation went, they didn't know in advance. So you usually want your Congress involved. What if more troops were pulled into it? What if more American soldiers were at risk or killed? That's why we have Congress involved in war powers. But he says he went to the businesses first. Second, as with so many other claims by this administration, the question also immediately becomes, because of their lack of credibility, is that even true? Did he go to those other oil companies before Congress? Several U.S. oil companies, which of course are governed by all kinds of laws and SEC regulations and energy laws, are saying they have boards, they have stockholders that, quote, the Trump administration has not consulted them, according to oil executives. The Times reports Maduro's regular public dancing and other displays of, quote, nonchalance were actually part of what persuaded some on the Trump team that the president was mocking them and trying to call what he believed to be a bluff. That is reporting on a very different motive, one of a more perhaps personal or vindictive nature. And Trump's anger, the Post reports, about the opposition leader Machado winning the Nobel Prize, something that he has openly pined for, has also reportedly affected his view of trying to pick winners and losers in that country's independent, autonomous project. Call it political leadership, because they don't have a traditionally healthy democracy right now, but his jealousy of her has potentially distorted his ability to work with her as the Nobel-winning opposition leader. One insider at the White House saying if she'd turned it down and said, I can't accept it because it's Trump's, she'd be the president of Venezuela today. And so those are just some of the top-line questions about what we're doing down there and why we're down there. Then you have the entire war of it all. Because either this is one of the most costly legal operations in American history, because the administration has claimed they view this as law enforcement. Of course, we don't usually have 30 people killed around the world in order to extract or arrest one suspect. So either it's a highly costly failed law enforcement operation, or it's war. And if it's war, it's an illegal war. And if you watch this program, you know that when there are 3 or 4 sides to something or it's murky, we will report that out. But the fact that we're broadcasting inside the United States does not prevent us from identifying when the United States is breaking the UN Charter and international law. Experts point out that unlike those boat strikes, which, however controversial, were conducted in international waters, this new operation striking Venezuela and abducting its president clearly violates Article 2 of the UN Charter that deals with the use of force coming out of World War II and everything that the powers that be in the West were supposed to have learned. Again, reading from this, it says that prohibition is the bedrock rule of the international system that separates the rule of law from anarchy. The consequences of flouting this rule so brazenly are likely to extend well beyond the case of Maduro's forcible ouster. I quote that at length because it is a fair and clear reading of what this is. War powers, regime change, something that the United States has repeatedly regretted in large-scale efforts like changing the regime of Vietnam or Iraq, and in smaller arenas, Somalia, Libya. In fact, if you follow American history, foreign policy, and the ensuing politics at all, and admittedly, sometimes the politics lag by years, that was the case in Vietnam and Iraq, but if you follow it at all, you know how often we have come to regret being rushed into aggressive wars, regime change meaning that we're not defending ourselves or even our interests, but just going out and saying, well, there's 183 countries and we're going to pick who we want to be in charge. And we're going to expect that because we do have a mighty military, there won't be blowback. And yet the entire post-World War II order, the United Nations, the Declaration of Human Rights, the UN Security Council, all of these things that were built directly with the involvement of the great powers, including, of course, the United States, were to avoid exactly these kind of sugar-high, quick-hit regime change quagmires that are at risk. And that has nothing to do with anyone's political opinions of Donald Trump. It just has to do with whether you know anything about our lived, learned lessons in history.